We're continuing our interview with Frank Marshall once more, trying to get his entire story recorded at once. We had done an interview with him in October of 2022, and that interview tape, for some reason, gave out at a certain point in his story. We're going to pick up with that there. Now, in the previous round, we had discussed how you wound up in the Army and talked about joining the 2nd Battalion of the 506th Regiment, 101st Airborne Division in A Company, and we had gotten you through A Company's big fight near the Ripcord Fire Base, kind of on July 22nd, 1970. You'd gotten out of that, gotten out of the field, and at this point, I think we're getting now toward the end of the enlistment. So now I think you can pick up the story here. Tell us how your time in Vietnam ended.
Well, I got wounded on July 22nd. July 23rd, when the Delta Company rescued us, they took me to the hospital, to the rear. I went to the hospital in Da Nang, where they operated on my arm. And then I went to Phu Bai evacuation center, and they cleaned up the wounds, different things. Then they sent me down to the Air Force Hospital in Cam Ranh Bay. So I spent 4 more weeks down there in the hospital. And I finally, I didn't have any contact with my company or anybody from my company. And the Red Cross had sent my mother a telegram, and it said, "Your son has been wounded in Vietnam and he is ambulatory." So right away she got the telegram and she didn't understand it completely, and she thought I lost limbs, and she went hysterical. Then she started, she called my father, my sister, everybody else, and my mother went to school with one of the congressmen from Pennsylvania. She contacted him. He got back to her and said it was my 3rd time wounded in Vietnam. And he sent an adjutant over to, that was there, I guess, in Vietnam, but up to my company to see what was going on. When he went up to the top sergeant there, they told him I was going back in the field because there was nobody from Alpha Company left. Really, it was all new guys, and they needed the experienced guys to go back out in the field with them. And when he went up there, and Top told him that, he told him, "No, you're not. You're not sending him back to the field. He's only got 2 weeks left to go before he goes home, and he's not going back to the field." So they said, "Okay." So then he came down to the hospital and saw me in Cam Ranh Bay, the Air Force Hospital, told me the situation. He went up and saw them. They wanted me to go back to the field. He told them I wasn't. He said, "So when you get back, you're going to be fine, and you got 2 weeks to get home." And I said, "Okay." And at that point, when I went back to the company, the hospital released me, and I went back up to the company. And I guess they didn't like the idea that I had connections back in the state, and Top Sergeant didn't like that. Captain Hawkins didn't like it. So they put me on detail. During the day, I burnt the urinals and, the crappers, and I had to burn, I was on the shit burn detail during the day. And then at night I'd have to be at the guard detail on the perimeter of Camp Evans. So I did that for 2 weeks, and then I got my orders to come home, and I came home.
Okay, while we're at it here, there's a lot of stories about what life is like in base camps and things like that, and that saying that's a place where you had racial issues, where you had drug issues, you had all kinds of issues like that. What was life actually like there in those 2 weeks?
Most of the time that I was in Vietnam and Alpha Company, whenever we got to the rear, we wanted to go back to the field because there were a lot of racial tensions. The blacks were saying they didn't want to come out and fight a white man's war, and they weren't going out to the field. So that's how that was. But what happened was we would get into fights with them. And I won't blame either party, but I think each party is to blame because each party had their own groups. So as you're in your group, you know, you get riled up because they had their Black Power where they would come in, stand in line in the chow line, and they would cut in front of everybody to get into the front of the chow line at the mess hall there. And then others wouldn't like it, and there would be fights. I couldn't stand it, to be honest with you. I mean, it was just ridiculous. You're out of the country in a different war zone, and you're fighting each other, and it was kind of like stupid. So that would happen. Drugs, they might be in the rear. I wasn't in the rear long enough to see any drugs. Out in the field, none of my guys ever did drugs. Never smoked pot. We were in combat too much for anybody to, you know, get out there and start doing drugs.
Right. Yeah, and that's a pretty standard. I mean, occasionally you hear about it, but not too long. Okay, just figured I would get that in there before we go. Okay, so your 2 weeks are up. Now what happens to you?
Well, now I get on a plane and come back. They fly me into Washington State. And I go into, I think it was Fort Lewis.
Yes.
And I go into Fort Lewis and processed out. And as you're processing out, you're going from room to room to room with different people in there, whether it be the medical, psychology, you know, all this. So the medical, he told me that I should stay because of my wounds. They should send me to the hospital there, and I should stay a couple weeks until they evaluated my wounds and see if I needed a pension or what treatment I needed and everything else. And he said, so you can stay a couple weeks and we'll take care of you. And I said, no, I want to go home. And I said, my parents were waiting at the airport for me at 6 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was I was coming in. I said, I'm all booked and everything. I just booked the plane, called home, told them what time I'd be home at the Philadelphia airport. So he said, okay, if that's what you want, then go to your VA hospital when you get home. I want you to go in there. He said, I'll have your records. You go in and then they'll straighten you out. I said, okay. Then I went into the, I guess the psychologist or whatever they call him. He went in there and he sat me down and he said, look, I see your record. I see what you went through. When you get home, it's going to be a different situation here. He says there are a lot of protests. They're not going to be friendly. He said people ain't going to want to talk to you about Vietnam. So when you get home, do not hold it in. He said talk. And if they don't want to hear it, keep telling them. He said do not keep your stories in yourself, in your head. I said, okay, and then I went to the next one and gave me my paycheck, gave me cash, and said, okay, get in the bus outside and that'll take you to the airport, you're out of here. And that was it. And I got on the bus, went to the airport, had to buy my own ticket home to Philadelphia, but he said, fly standby, you know, you'll be fine. Well, when I got to the airport and they gave me a standby ticket, said you'll be fine. And they first flew me to Chicago. And then I would have a layover and then jump on a plane to Philadelphia. And I got to Chicago and there's nobody in the airport. It was in the middle of the night. It was pretty quiet. And I'm sitting there where I'm to get onto the plane to Philadelphia. And all of a sudden, if it was boarding at 6 o'clock, it's empty, it's 5:30. All of a sudden, hundreds of people start filling in the airport. I mean, they were coming from all over. So I ran up to the girl at the counter and I said, I'm flying standby, am I going to get on? And she says, I don't think so on this one. She said, we're pretty booked. I said, well, I got to get a ticket. She said, you can go and buy a ticket instead of transferred from standby. And you got to go to the ticket counter. She said, and the only thing she said, oh, you can go down to the ticket counter and buy the ticket. I said, all right. So I ran all the way down there. I got to the ticket counter. She said, the only thing we have is first class. I said, I don't care, I'll take it. And it was a lot more money, but I took the first class and I ran all the way back to the counter where I was getting on the plane, and the girl said, oh yeah, we got room. And I was like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. So I got on the plane, and I came home. And I got to Philadelphia Airport. And of course it wasn't like the airports today. You got off the plane, you walked down onto the tarmac and into the terminal. And my parents were waiting at the terminal for me. And there was a group of protesters there, and it was about 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. And there were protesters at the airport. Mm-hmm. Now, it wasn't an organized protest, and there was a group of people there, and then they just started hollering at me. My mother got like hysterical. She started shaking and everything else. And my father, he being a World War II veteran, he was getting hot under the collar. So my grandfather was there also with us, and we all just walked past him and walked out. And the whole thing was a mess. They saw me, and here they are, and everybody's hollering at the airport. And it wasn't an organized protest. They didn't spit on me. Mm-hmm. They were just yelling things to me. And everybody in my party was like upset. So then they put me in the car, and we went back home, and I lived on Tioga Street there by 11th and Ontario. And I got home, and they stopped to take, my grandfather lived there, because my parents had moved while I was in the service. Mm-hmm. They moved up to Northeast Philly. So we went back down to the old neighborhood down there at 11th Street and dropped my grandfather off from the airport. And I saw some of my friends and some of my family that's still down there. Got back in the car, went home to the Northeast to their new home. And then they had a party. That weekend, my parents had planned this big party. My father was a musician, guitar player, had a band. And the band was in the backyard playing. And they had cases and cases of beer and booze and whiskey and everything. And there must have been 100 or more people came in from my family and friends. All day long they were coming in and out. So it was pretty good. They had banners on the street for me. So it wasn't all that bad for me coming home. I didn't come home to an empty thing.
Right. All right. Now that you are back and you're out of the Army, now what do you do?
I took some time. I just took a couple weeks. I just wanted to relax, eat mom's good home cooking. And then I went and got a job back in the printing industry I was in. And I had no problem getting the job because I was experienced in it. And I was working, but yet I was going out every night with the guys I knew and the clubs. The club scene in the 70s was like fantastic. Every night was a different club. And every night of the week I'd be at a different club. And I'd be drinking. And sometimes I wonder now how I ever made it home drinking and driving. I mean, it was one thing on my mind. Go out, drink, party, and meet the girls. Then it went into the disco era. And I got in with all the crowds that went to all these clubs, so I got special invitations for all the clubs wherever they opened up, whichever one was the greatest, whether it was New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey. So I was doing that. And of course, I got laid off from my printing job because I wasn't performing that well. And I went to work and I tried getting other jobs and I just didn't want to work. And I couldn't sleep unless I had a drink because I never thought about Vietnam, but that's why I couldn't sleep. I mean, at that time I didn't worry about Vietnam.
So you hadn't taken the man's advice and you weren't going around telling people about Vietnam?
No, I didn't tell anybody. We didn't talk about it. If I told the girl in the nightclub I just got home from Vietnam, they shied away from you because they thought you were crazy. So I did that for a long time. And then I continued to do that. And then I went to work for a roofing company. A hot roofer, not shingle. I did no shingle. I did hot tar, pitch and slag and all that. And I worked with them for a while, and then one of my buddies said, let's open up a roofing business. So we did. And he never worked as a roofer, and he just put up some money and everything else, and we started a business, and it started doing good. And he didn't like it. He didn't like the work, so he got out. He said, you can have the trucks, you can have everything, I'm out of here. And the business blossomed. I mean, I was running a couple crews a day. I was doing very good at roofing. But I was still partying. My trucks are running. I got somebody running the business, and I'm out partying all night. And that didn't work out too well. So I sold the business, but I sold it practically for nothing. I mean, I had to get out of it, and the VA at that time this is the time now around 85 when I got together with some of my guys in Alpha Company. Chip Collins saw it. We had a picture in the paper there, and one of the guys saw it in the paper and said he's trying to contact all the Ripcord Association. That was Chip Collins, and he only had a couple people with him, and then I got involved with him, and then we got involved with Chuck Hawkins, and from there, then I started talking about my Vietnam experience because I had guys to talk to. If I talked to other Vietnam veterans, they didn't believe me. They thought I was telling stories about what I went through. So I couldn't tell them nothing. So I would talk to the Ripcord guys. And then the more I got involved with the Ripcord Association, the more I got involved with different veterans in Philadelphia, had leaders and stuff, and the VA guy. I was sitting at a dinner one morning. We were building the memorial in Philly. One morning we had breakfast with Alexander, one of the state treasurers or whatever it was from Pennsylvania, and then General Haig was there for lunch, and General Westmoreland was there for dinner. And I went through the whole day with all of them, and I was sitting with the president of the VA in Philadelphia and got to know him a little bit, and he says to me, Frank, why don't you come down to the VA? And he says, get evaluated. We'll talk to some counselors. And I didn't want to be bothered. I said, I got no problem. And everybody at the table laughed and started saying I have a big problem. And that's the first time that I really realized that I had a problem from Vietnam. I didn't think I did. Everybody else did. And that when the president and everybody else and all these big heads of officials and everybody of everything, I figured I'd better go down. So I went to counseling in the 90s. I started. And I went through with their counselor for 11 years. And I think it helped me pretty good. So I got out of Philadelphia with all the crowd I was hanging with and everything, went over to Jersey and got into real estate. And I started doing pretty good. So that kind of like slowed me down a little, but not a lot, until kind of about, I started dating a girl in the year maybe 2013, 2014, and got along good enough, and then we moved down here to, my mother had passed, so I was alone now, and my father had passed before that, and her father had just passed. So we said, let's go down Myrtle Beach for Christmas and New Year's. We did that. Was going back again in Easter, and a buyer wanted to see the house that was looking at the one next to it. Let him go through it. He came in, out. We didn't think he would do it. Halfway down to Myrtle Beach, they called. He wanted to buy the house, so we found a house in Myrtle Beach. I've been there ever since, and I've never been happier in my life.
So really, for you, I mean, the falling in with the Ripcord veterans themselves, that is sort of part of a turning point, as well as working with the VA. It's like, yeah, you could now talk to these people and connect, and once you started, you could work your way in with a lot of the rest of the group. So I guess if you were just drinking with some guys and talking about, July 22nd, 1970, they might look at you and go, oh, come on. Would that be it? They think you were telling Zad
If I told anybody the story from March 12th,
yeah,
okay, when the first time we went in, I tell people about my first 5 minutes in the field when the helicopter crashed. It chopped up 6 guys, and heads and pieces of body are flying over, and I'm in the field for 5 minutes. People didn't believe that. And then I would go into the March 12th incident. People didn't believe that. And then I go into the July 22nd, and people really didn't believe it because they never heard, even Vietnam veterans never heard of five-base ripcord.
Right.
So it's like, how can we tell anybody when you never heard of the incident, and it's one of the top 10 worst battles ever in Vietnam, and nobody's ever heard of it?
Of course, because you got the Ripcord Association, eventually people did start telling the story because the author Keith Nolan found you.
Well, the beginning was when 1985 we started. We had the first reunion in 1986 with 12 guys. Now, the next year or so, we had this guy that Chip Collins knew him, Jim Failhill. He started to write the book. And he was interviewing guys, and he was starting to write this book about Ripcord, and he just got completely overwhelmed and confused. Keith Nolan comes in, so that's when Chuck Hawkins and the publisher that worked with Keith's other 9 books got Keith Nolan together with us, and for a couple years he interviewed people, but we didn't have everybody we have now, so he didn't get the full story. And now you're talking close to in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And you're home almost 30 years, which doesn't seem like a long time, but your memory and 30 years later, Keith just couldn't get the stories all right. He did the best he could with what he had and what everybody was telling him. Now, guys we didn't know at the point that got in touch with us afterwards read the book and said, this is not right. It's right, but it's not. That's what happened, but that's not exactly how it happened. So as it went through, that's what happened. So now we get to talk with people. They come in. I've had guys come into the reunion and say, they get to the hotel and they want to stop. They don't want to come in. Like Floyd Alexander, his wife, grabbed him because he didn't want to come in. And we grabbed him out in the hall, talked to him, got him in, and they never missed another one for years. And then you had the company clerks that would come in. And they'd say, I don't want to get involved with you guys because I was in the rear, I was your clerk. I didn't see any combat. And we would all tell them, like, are you crazy? Without the company clerk, we wouldn't have had our mail. our food, our supplies, ammo, clothing, our mail from home. You made sure we had everything, so you're as much a part of our group as anybody.
And you've made a point of including the helicopter crews and people in various kinds of support units. It's not
Anybody that was involved in the Ripcord operation, that was in RAO, was welcome. The helicopter pilots, damn, I mean, they took us all over. I got more respect for the helicopter pilots than anybody. I mean, they flew in under fire. When they rescued us on the 23rd, the morning of the 23rd, it was like hell. And they came in and they didn't care. They were just flying in and out and everything else and taking, and that was the scariest time of my life when that helicopter, they threw me on the helicopter. And the helicopter, because the LZ they cut was so small, it was just between the trees they knocked down. The helicopter had to lift up so slow until he got above the tree level, and then he took off. That was the scariest time of my life. I mean, just wait, we were sitting ducks. So the helicopter pilots, the artillery guys that kept us, firing with us, everybody that was involved in anything to do with Ripcord has my respect.
Yeah, and it's still an active organization. Now we're now getting to the point where we're losing a fair number of the Ripcord guys.
Every year. We're losing maybe one a month now because of age, illness, or just accidents. And it's kind of scary, but it's a shame. So we're getting down to a level now that as far as the association and how long it can stay together, we still have a lot. We still have about 600 active members. I think next year in Myrtle Beach, in the year 2024, October, that's going to be one of the biggest and best reunions we've had, I think.
All right. Is there anything else you want to add here to the record, or do you think we've closed out your story pretty well?
I think that about sums it up with what I did before. Now this is the third one, so.
Okay, I think we probably got it now. All right, so thanks very much, Dan.